Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 315. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. A lot to cover on today's show, including several articles that I've written recently. So make sure you're following me on Twitter at Kyle Anzalone _ to keep up with all the work I put out, the show, the news roundup, and the articles that I write. The show is hosted at the Libertarian Institute, where I'm the news editor. And so be sure to check out the Institute. We have a weekly email that goes out at the Institute that you can sign up for that newsletter. You can also now subscribe to the Libertarian Institute on Substack. So great ways to be sure you're keeping up with not only my content, but all the great stuff we put out at the Institute. You can find the show on the blog at antiwar.com. We have YouTube, Rumble, and Odysee for the video version of the show. Be sure to subscribe, and especially if you're on YouTube, you got to hit that notification bell, or they're never going to tell you that there's a new episode of the show out. Listen to the audio podcast anywhere you listen to podcasts. If it's not up somewhere you want to listen to it, get in touch with me, preferably on Twitter, and we will try to get the show up to where you want to listen to it. And then you can support the show by doing your CBD shopping at Paloma Verde, CBD.com, promo code PEACE. Wide variety, high quality CBD products is what they sell at Paloma Verde. You're new to CBD, they have a great education page on their website to help you out with that. You can also get in contact with Paloma Verde and they'll help you to select products that could help you. You can also if you're an existing CBD user, use that promo code PEACE when you check out, PEACE. And you're going to get your CBD at a good price and find the lab test results right there on the website. PalomaVerdeCBD.com, promo code PEACE. Help out yourself, help the show. All right, let's get into it. The first story I have to talk about today, I wrote for antiwar.com on August 21st, titled, Russian Ambassador Says We Simply Have No Contact with Western Diplomats. In an interview with the Financial Times, a top Russian diplomat says there is no communication with Western diplomats at the UN. The complete freeze in contact led the Kremlin to assess there is no possibility of a diplomat solution to the war in Ukraine. Gadilov is the name of the diplomat. Russia's permanent representative to the UN in Geneva told Financial Times, "We do not have any contacts with Western delegations," he said of his day-to-day work in Geneva. On the protocol side, we do not see each other. Privately, we do not have contacts. Unfortunately, we simply do not talk to each other. And I think this is really important. I know there's been a lot of discussion throughout this war about the lack of contact, particularly coming from the Russian side, lamenting that they don't talk to their counterparts in the West. But I think this is really showing, he's like saying that this is at the ground, the foundational level, that these contacts do not exist. And I think this is really important, as veteran diplomat Peter Van Buren has pointed out. Diplomacy doesn't happen between leaders, right? Like Biden and Xi, Biden and Putin. They maybe they'll sit down and hash out like the final detail or two, but like these agreements to end major conflicts or to settle lasting disputes are put together over months and months between lower level diplomats. Even Blinken and Lavrov probably aren't going to be the two that hammer out a lot of the important details. And so it's important for these people to have relationships, probably to like each other. Look, people in the Washington, D.C. foreign policy establishment are generally seem to be fairly petty people. If they don't like someone, then they're going to find excuses to, erode diplomacy with that country. Likewise, if they like someone, they're probably going to try to encourage diplomacy with that country so they have, more state-sponsored meals and lunches with them. And I'm sure, just people generally like being around people they like. And so if the relationships don't exist, if everybody's snubbing each other in the hallways, then, you really have to worry. And I think, there's always the assumption that there has to be, a more adult way. Somebody is looking at this with a more adult mind frame, and it's really not this kind of just very human, but what we refer to as like a high school era like thinking and mentality. But that's really how a lot of people I interact with, places I've worked are. And so I'm guessing that diplomats who are not the best of us are, the same as the average person or worse. He went on to say the lack of contact between officials means there is no potential end to the war through talks. Now, I do not see any possibility for diplomatic contacts, and the more conflict grows on, the more difficult it will be to have a diplomatic solution. So I want to take a second here and talk about how the Financial Times presented this and how Western media is really presenting this when Russian officials made these kind of statements. Because what they are saying is that, look, there's no diplomatic contact between Russia and Kiev, between Russia and the West, and so there's no way to diplomatically end this war. And it means the war is going to have a military end. And so Western press will say, oh, Russian official admits the only way this war is going to end is through Russia conquering Ukraine. And that's not what the official is saying. He's lamenting that there's no diplomatic contact, that there's no diplomatic solution to this. I think, something people really miss is Russia was very eager to negotiate with Ukraine in the early months of this war before Ukraine broke off talks, with at one point Lavrov even saying that they had a workable proposal. Kiev had made a workable proposal to Moscow during talks sponsored by Turkey, I believe, and that after Boris Johnson, the Ukrainian prime minister, not Ukrainian, UK prime minister, went to Kiev, then talks ended, and there hasn't been any real discussions on ending the war since. All right, so back to the article. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has only spoken with the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov once in the past 6 months. The Russian diplomat said Western military support for Ukraine and preventing peace talks means the war in Ukraine will have a military end, and so they, Kiev and its Western supporters, will fight until the last Ukrainian, he said. Lavrov said Ukraine made a workable proposal in March before Kiev broke off talks following the following month. Multiple sources reported UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson visited Kiev as talks were progressing, discouraging Ukrainian President Zelensky from engaging with the Kremlin. The Russian diplomat praised Turkey's President Recep Erdogan for attempting to facilitate a diplomatic end to the war in Ukraine. Ankara has hosted talks between Kiev and Moscow. Turkey and the UN were essential in crafting the deal that allowed wheat to be exported through Black Sea ports. While Russia is happy with Turkey's mediation efforts, Financial Times reported 2 weeks ago that the Western diplomats were concerned about Ankara's ties with Moscow. On Saturday, Deputy Treasury Secretary Wally Adamino told Turkish Deputy Finance Minister Yanis Alatis that Russian companies and individuals are attempting to bypass Western sanctions in Turkey. The Deputy Treasury Secretary went on to warn the White House was attempting to enforce those sanctions. And so, this is another really important part to this story, right? Is the discrepancy between how the West looks at Turkey's mediation efforts versus how Russia looks at the mediation efforts, while Russia is encouraging them, even though they're led by a member of NATO, right? Turkey is a NATO member state, and so Turkey's leading these talks. They're a NATO member, and yet Russia is happy with that, and the West is unhappy that their party is leading these talks. Is very interesting, and that they would go as far as to actually, get to the point of threatening Turkey and stuff like that, I think is very disturbing and concerning. If Turkey is being used by some Russians to bypass U.S. sanctions, that's something that's going to happen, and probably something that you have to let happen if you really want to let any kind of diplomacy start to bloom in Ukraine. So, again, important stuff here is that Russia is saying that it's not their preference that the war ends militarily, but that's what's happening because of this. The lack of contacts at any level, including what it seems like, down to the lower level diplomats, extremely concerning. And then the way both of these countries are approaching Turkey is very telling. All right, next article I wrote for the Libertarian Institute. Russian officials indicate nuclear weapons are not an option to use against Ukraine. As the war in Ukraine completes its 6th month, senior Russian officials are dismissing the idea nuclear weapons will be used in Ukraine. Deputy Foreign Minister of Russia, Sergei Rabkov, said the ultimate weapon would only be deployed for self-defense and in emergency circumstances. In an interview, Rabkov said the Kremlin would deploy its nuclear weapons in extreme circumstances. Aggression using conventional weapons when the very existence of the state is threatened. The key word in both scenarios is aggression. In other words, the use of nuclear weapons by Russia is possible only in response to an attack for self-defense in emergency circumstances. There is no place for conjecture or fantasies here. So he is trying to lay out in no uncertain and very definitive terms that Russia will not be using nuclear weapons in Ukraine. So, this very firm statement is important. Russia has, made threats and placed their nuclear weapons on higher alert since this war has started. But I think it's very important for people to understand that that's really not directed at Ukraine, but because of the larger conflict that Russia sees between Ukraine and the West, and they now see the war in Ukraine as a war against NATO because of all the NATO support. Last week, the Russian defense minister, Sergei Shoigu, said Russia has no need to use nuclear weapons for its military operations in Ukraine. He went on to say that the idea of Russia would deploy weapons of mass destruction against Kiev was based on absolute lies. And there's probably some truth to the idea that using, any kind of major nuclear attack in Ukraine would be pretty counterproductive for Russia. It's taking land that's been nuked isn't quite as valuable as taking land that's been taken with any other weaponry. And so this is a major point to make here. Also, just Ukraine is right next door to Russia now. I guess maybe there is a possibility of using like a small battlefield nuke or two that wouldn't have too many negative environmental implications for Russia. But overall, I think Russia doesn't really see its nuclear arsenal being deployed in Ukraine at all, and that's what we're seeing from these officials. Now, importantly, while dismissing the idea nuclear weapons would be used in Ukraine, Rabkov painted a grim picture of the future of nuclear disarmament. The diplomat indicated any talks to preserve the New START treaty are unlikely. Frankly, the very possibility of its resumption is far from obvious, given the recklessly aggressive policy Washington is pursuing towards Russia, he said. New START is the only remaining agreement that controls the size of Moscow and Washington's nuclear stockpiles. The treaty was extended for 5 years in 2021. The White House said it will not negotiate with the Kremlin on extending nuclear weapons agreement until Russia withdraws from Ukraine. Moscow recently announced it was suspending its inspections of its nuclear stockpile. The Kremlin said Western sanctions prevent Russia from inspecting Washington's nuclear arsenal. And as far as I could tell, that those are the inspections under New START. I'm not sure if there's maybe other inspections that go on from the IAEA, from some kind of UN agreement that do provide just a little bit more regulation and oversight here. But they are apparently not letting American inspectors in because Russian inspectors can't get to the American arsenal because of Western sanctions. All right, next up is a story I wrote with Will Porter for the Libertarian Institute. Dennis Rodman, I'm going to Russia to help that girl. In an interview with NBC News, former NBA champion Dennis Rodman says he got permission to travel to Russia to seek the release of WNBA star Brittany Grenier. Rodman previously used his relationship with North Korean Supreme Leader Kim Jong-un to help secure the release of Kenneth Bay. Rodman indicated that he could make the trip as early as this week. He did not say who gave him permission to travel to Russia. Rodman would not technically need authorization from the White House to travel to Russia, but Moscow would need to provide him with a visa in order to enter the country. The State Department advises Americans not to travel to Russia, and Western sanctions on Moscow make visiting it a logistical challenge. Rodman appears undeterred by the complicated geopolitical situation, telling NBC, I got permission to go to Russia to help that girl. I'm trying to go this week. The U.S. has cease contact with the Kremlin uh, since Putin ordered his army to invade Ukraine in February. Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov have spoken once in the past 6 months. 3 weeks ago, the top diplomats held a call about prisoner swap, but Grenier remains in Russia. On Sunday, in an interview with Financial Times, Russia's ambassador to the United Nations says Ukraine's war will likely drag on because the U.S. refusal to engage in negotiations. And this is the statement from the previous article that I read. We do not have any contacts with the Western delegations. While Rodman does not hold any official government credentials, he has netted diplomatic successes in the past. After Christian missionary Kenneth Bae was freed from North Korea in I think 2014. This is Bay. I thank Dennis Rodman for being a catalyst for my release. The NBA star also appeared at the 2018 Singapore summit between Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un. Putin and Rodman met in Moscow in 2014. Rodman said about the Russian leader, "You know, he's actually cool. I'm not going to say I'm not talking about politics. It ain't about politics. This was my first time meeting him. He just walked in, shook my hand, and left with all of his people. I stayed and had a good time at his restaurant." And so I do think that this is something important here to talk about, because a lot of people are just saying, oh, Rodman called Putin cool, when he's, not saying it. He clearly says it's not an endorsement of Putin and his politics. I'm just saying I met him one time. He seemed like a nice guy, is basically what he's saying. And if you're going to go to another country and try to secure the release of somebody who, even if it was very unfair, broke a Russian law, to come in with an attitude of I had a nice time, I met him, he has a good restaurant, things like that, is probably more productive than the way the U.S. has approached the situation, which is basically Russia bad, Russia bad, Russia bad, you must release Grenier, even though is extremely hypocritical coming from Biden, who is fundamental in locking a lot of Americans in jail for drug charges themselves, some far more strict than the ones that Grenier received in Russia. So, somewhat hopeful. Now, I want to put a caveat on this. The White House came out and said that they think the Rodman trip will, be unlikely to help anything and probably counterproductive or something along those lines. While it sounds like, the White House is just trying to poo-poo somebody heading to Russia to actually engage in diplomacy, I think it is worth noting that Russia has said a couple times now that they want the diplomacy on the prisoner swap between the U.S. and Russia to be done quiet. They've called for quiet diplomacy. And so, and I believe Rabkov actually said that in the interview where he mentioned Russia's nuclear policy. And so it is just worth knowing that Russia is calling for quiet diplomacy, although maybe it is going to require somebody going over there and actually acting like they don't hate all Russians in order to facilitate this deal. And Dennis Rodman could be the perfect person for that. All right, there are a few other stories from my news roundup on Russia that in the war in Ukraine that I just wanted to touch on. Ukraine's military chief says nearly 9,000 Ukrainian soldiers have been killed since Russia invaded. The next up is Turkey has doubled its import of Russian oil this year, and that was from Middle East Eye. Next up, a news story that I wrote on the Korea situation for antiwar.com on August 21st. U.S. South Korea to resume provocative live-action war games after 4-year pause. Washington and Seoul will kick off live-action military drills in Korea on Monday. North Korea views the exercises as highly provocative rehearsals of removing its government in Pyongyang. The U.S. canceled live war games with South Korea in 2018. The military drills, dubbed Yurchi Freedom Shield, will involve thousands of soldiers and likely last about 2 weeks. The Financial Times, I believe, reported 11 days, and Bloomberg reported 2 weeks. So I said about 2 weeks. I'm guessing it's going to be right in the middle of those two, if not just 11 days. Bloomberg reports, although official details have not been released, the drills are likely to involve warships, aircraft, and armored vehicles. President Donald Trump abandoned live military exercises with Seoul during a period of warming relations with Pyongyang. In response to the U.S. scaling back war games and other signs of good faith, North Korea canceled missile tests, dismantled some testing sites, and removed some military positions along the DMZ. Since taking office, President Joe Biden has increased the American military presence in the Pacific, mainly in the name of great power competition with China. However, North Korea views the U.S. military as an aggressive force with the aim of regime change in the DPRK. After Washington signed a trilateral pact with Seoul and Tokyo in May, Pyongyang denounced the move as the U.S. attempting to create an Asian-style alliance, NATO-style alliance in Asia. In response to the failed diplomacy with the Trump administration and increased military pressure from the Biden White House, Kim's government has conducted a record number of missile tests in 2022. U.S. officials have speculated for several months that North Korea is preparing to test a nuclear weapon. Pyongyang has tested its nuclear weapons in the past. The last detonation was carried out in 2017. South Korea's defense ministry said Seoul and Washington would react sternly if Pyongyang conducted a nuclear weapons test. So, just, a little bit more analysis here, of course, is I think this was the key thing that Trump did to reduce tensions with North Korea. North Korea sees these as preparing for a decapitation of the North Korean state, and that the U.S. was carrying these out with South Korea every year or twice a year. Very provocative, very problematic for North Korea, because North Korea has to worry that, one of these drills is going to be a front for a natural invasion, and so it requires them to call up a lot of the reservists and things like that, and a lot of these drills happen during times that are either strategic, like farming times, or whatever reason would be economically labor intensive, and so it really harms the Korean economy when these drills happen. Now, I think Trump just said they were wasteful and unneeded, and that's why he was canceling them. But looking at the timing of when the drills were canceled and what was going on, it was clear that it was a pretty good show of faith by the United States, that they were at least looking to ratchet down their hostile military position with North Korea. Now, of course, the Singapore summit happens and North Korea continues to scale back its nuclear abilities. It removes an engine testing site. It shuts down a nuclear testing site. They start to remove positions along the DMZ. Now, it's very important to remember that as, we have Trump versus Biden's policy on this issue, we also in South Korea have President Moon Jae-in's policy versus the new President Yoon, who is far more aggressive than Moon. And so, that's, I think, a very important distinction here, too, that, gets lost for almost all American audiences. But Moon Jae-in in South Korea, I think, was a real driving force and deserves most of the credit for what happened positively on the Korean Peninsula during Trump's term, even though, of course, in the U.S., Trump gets all the credit. So anyways, then Hanoi happened, and of course, Trump failed to realize that personnel mate's policy, invited John Bolton, who blew up the talks. He then, went to the DMZ, and for the remainder of the Trump administration, he, I think, sent enough positive signals to Kim Jong-un that the North Koreans, continued their missile testing moratorium. Now, it was when Biden took over and started to, really ramp up not only the pivot to Asia, not the aggressive policy against China that has seen the U.S. put a lot more military assets in the region, which, while the U.S. says, it's about Beijing, Pyongyang says, well, if you, shift those all 90 degrees north, then we're in target of all of those military assets as well, and so this is a real issue for us. And then of course, signing the trilateral agreements, quad NATO, the quad agreement, AUKUS, all these things that the US is doing in the Indo-Pacific, I think really worries North Korea as well. And so this is a very significant event. I think it is the final step away from the Singapore summit, and so I think we're going to see potentially a more aggressive North Korea in the months to come. All right, next up, I have some stories from my news roundup that I just wanted to mention. This from Gizmodo. The Army transfers control of military satellites to the Space Force. I'm not sure at this point if this is going to have any actual meaning other than probably just some pretty expensive rebranding, handing out new patches, putting new signs on buildings and rooms and things like that to indicate this is now the Space Force and not the Army. Next up from Defense News, Air Force Special Operations Command CV-22 Osprey aircraft fleet has been grounded over unknown issues with the clutch. My understanding is that fleet is still grounded as of today. The Army, this according to Defense News again, the Army awarded Lockheed Martin and General Dynamics a $15 million contract to develop concepts for the terrestrial layer system echelons above brigade. The system is a part of the electronic warfare program. According to Defense News, the EAB is an electromagnetic attack and collection system that integrates cyber signal intelligence and electronic warfare capabilities. The overall value of the prototype project is expected to be $163 million in all phases. The Pentagon award, this from the Defense Post, the Pentagon awarded Blue Halo a $24 million contract to supply a Titan counter-defense drone system. Next up from Yahoo News, former Congressman David Rivera is being sued by Venezuela's state oil company. It claims the congressman accepted $50 million from Caracas but did not perform any work. All right. Moving on, some news on China from my roundup. A lot of important things, of course, happening around the Taiwanese island as the U.S. continues to do very provocative things and seemingly ratchet up tensions with Beijing. First story here from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. Washington and Taipei will begin formal trade negotiations this fall, despite warnings from China against the idea. China says, look, the U.S. has this one China policy that says the Chinese government is the entity of, mainland China and Taiwan. And so if you're signing bilateral agreements with Taipei against Beijing's interest, then you're kind of negating the idea that Taiwan isn't an independent country. Taiwan says 4 Chinese aircraft crossed the median line in the Taiwan Strait. This is something that's been happening repeatedly since Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. Before this was the case, Pelosi visited Taiwan. China really respected this barrier, but now they continue to fly over it, although not in Taiwan's official airspace. This is an escalation. Next up from CNN, Japan is considering deploying 1,000 long-range missiles to counter China. This would be a fairly significant increase. And then maybe the most important thing here, and while this is the third major delegation of U.S. officials to go to Taiwan in the past few weeks, and so I'm guessing there's a little bit of return value on return going down as far as the Chinese anger for this and also the political value. So it's, there's not millions of people watching Eric Holcomb's flight go into Taiwan, but nonetheless, this is still provocative and still drawing reactions from China at a time of already extremely heightened tensions. So to Dave DeCamp's story, Indiana's Governor Eric Holcomb and other state officials arrived in in Taiwan on Sunday, marking the third delegation to visit the island this month amid soaring tensions between the U.S. and China. Holcomb, a Republican, said the trip was to boost economic cooperation between the U.S. and Taiwan with the focus on the semiconductor industry. The Chinese Foreign Ministry said China always firmly opposes the U.S. conducting official exchanges with Taiwan and under any form or guise. All right, next up. This is, I think, a pretty important story here that Dave DeCamp wrote up on August 22nd for antiwar.com. Report, U.S. plans to continue talks with the Taliban on frozen Afghan funds. Reuters reported on Monday that the Biden administration plans to continue talks with the Taliban on the Afghan central bank reserves that have been seized by the U.S. as millions of Afghans are facing starvation. The Reuters report cited three sources familiar with the matter and came after either earlier reports that said the Biden administration did not release the $7 million in Afghan funds that are being held by the U.S. Federal Reserve. The U.S. and the Taliban held talks on the central bank reserves back in June, but it wasn't clear if there would be any further negotiations after the U.S. claimed it killed al-Qaeda leader Ayman al-Zawahiri in a drone strike in Kabul. The U.S. said Zawahiri's presence in Kabul meant the Taliban violated the Doha Agreement, which paved the way for the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, but the Taliban denied knowing Zawahiri was in Kabul and haven't confirmed that he was killed in the drone strike. The Reuters report said the U.S. will continue the talks with the Taliban despite Zawahiri's alleged presence in Kabul. U.S. sources accuse the Taliban of dragging out the process by not complying with international demands, such as replacing Taliban militants that are currently the head of Afghan Central Bank, known as the DAB. Earlier this year, President Biden signed an executive order that would make $3.5 billion of the Afghan reserves available for families in 9/11, even though the people of Afghanistan had absolutely nothing to do with the September 11th attacks. Last week, a group of 9/11 families sent a letter to President Biden urging him to return funds to the Afghan people. The letter said the families don't want the money if it would take away from the starving Afghans. The UN has warned that a staggering 95% of the Afghans aren't getting enough to eat, and that nearly one half of the population is facing acute hunger. A UN official said in March that the situation threatens an entire generation of Afghans, and so this is absolutely really important that the White House is now saying that these talks are going to go on. Hopefully we get some more information on why it was originally reported that the talks would be broken off if the Biden administration reconsidered, or exactly what all is going on with this. Now, some stories from my roundup on the Middle East to wrap up today's show. There are several important things going on. One of the most interesting stories here was from The Guardian, though. The Guardian reports two sources say the CIA disagrees with Israel labeling SIDS human rights groups as terror organizations. Israel labeled as terror groups SIDS groups like Al-Haq, the Bison Center for Research and Development, Defense of Children International Palestine, the Union of Agricultural Workers, the Union of Palestinian Women Committees. Earlier this year, Israel passed intelligence about the designations to the U.S., but a CIA intelligence assessment of the material did not find any evidence to support the claim, according to two people familiar with the study. Now, this was a big deal when it happened. Unfortunately, I think Israel basically, them dropping the story in the claim was enough to throw people off of the concern that Israel had labeled these groups terrorist groups. Pegasus spyware had been found on a lot of their phones, so it was clear that they were, being surveilled, and they're just human rights groups. This is clearly inappropriate, and Israel enforcing its apartheid regime over the Palestinians. But nonetheless, the fact that even sources talking with from the CIA are saying this, I think is fairly significant and interesting. So, speaking of Pegasus, the CEO of NSO Group resigns. The Israeli firm was sanctioned by the U.S. after the proliferation of its Pegasus spyware was revealed, and its group sold the technology to countries that spied on foreign officials, dissidents, and human rights activists. Next up from The Guardian, Ben & Jerry's lost its court battle to prevent its parent company Unilever from selling ice cream in the West Bank. Remember, this was a big decision. Israel, says, well, these settlements in the West Bank, Ben & Jerry's, we're going to stop selling our ice cream here. We don't want to support these settlements. And then there was a lot of pressure from Israel. Ultimately, the parent company Unilever caved and elected to, sell that ice cream in the West Bank. I think by, selling it like the rights to do that to a subsidiary that would then sell it. And the Ben & Jerry's company was attempting to battle its parent company through court and then lost that battle. Next, on some news on the Iran deal, the EU says it hopes the U.S. will respond to its final text proposal that would save the Iran nuclear deal. It's interesting. Now it's being reported that it's the U.S. that hasn't responded, when Al Jazeera had reported last week that the U.S. had responded to the EU text and that they were waiting on the Iranian response. So I think maybe what happened here is that the Iranians sent back a response to the EU proposal that the EU said was reasonable, and maybe the US is now pondering over that. The US says it's working as quickly as it can to respond to the EU proposal, that according to Ned Price. And then this story from Jason Ditz at antiwar.com on Iran. A newly leaked video making its rounds on social media shows Iran's new interior minister pledging loyalty to his political party while taking office, this raising more talk about corruption. A member of parliament commented that this corruption is preventing culture in which ministries and state officials and their positions are considered business projects for their owners. Even if this leak does reveal specific corruption, the odds of it leading to any criminal repercussions is low. Loyalty to the party is key, and with the current coalition, there is little reason to believe leadership will react, even if the public demands it. And then this was also written up by Jason Ditz, and I also found it on ABC News. The U.S. bat Giants Brigade, the UAE bat, the United Arab Emirates, not the United States of America, bat Giants Brigade seized oil fields in Yemen. This is pretty important because these oil fields here are in one of the places that they could get the oil, but the Giants Brigade are the jihadists that the UAE enlisted into their cause, and so pretty concerning about who now controls these oil fields. All right, everyone. That's where I'm wrapping up the show for today. Thank you so much for tuning in. Find the show at the Libertarian Institute, antiwar.com, YouTube, Rumble, Odysee, and subscribe, and follow me on Twitter at Kyle Anzalone _. Thanks, everyone.